Feature of liberalization is freedom in fixing the prices of goods and services. Disinvestment means transfer in the public sector enterprises to the private sector. Reduction in tax rates and lifting of unnecessary controls over the economy. Hello everyone, I am Purnima, faculty in the Department of Commerce, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Temple of Excellence. In continuation of my sessions of the third chapter of Business Studies of 2nd PUC, in this third session, I will be discussing about the new industrial policy introduced by the Indian government in 1991. Now, in this session, we will be discussing about the industrial policy which was introduced by the Indian government in order to bring about economic development in the nation. So let us look at what are the industrial policies which were introduced by the Indian government. Now, the broad features of the industrial policy in July 1991, here the first one was the government reduced the number of industries under compulsory licensing to 6. Now, before this 1991 industrial policy of 1991, we had to get license from the government to start any industry. Now, this was a hurdle for all the businessmen. So they had to take permission from the government to start any new industry. Now, in order to make the rules more investor friendly and business friendly, the government decided to abolish the system of licensing. So this system of licensing was reduced for only identified 6 industries, and all other industries could be started without any license from the government. Now, the next feature is many of the industries which were reserved for the public sector under the earlier policy were de-reserved. So, whatever were the industries which were coming under the public sector, it may be the service of LPG gas, or it may be the Indian telephone industry, or it may be the television industry. So, these were all under the public sector, or they were all under the control of the government. Now, after the reforms of 1991, the government decided to de-reserve all these sectors. So, even whether it is the telecommunication sector or the television or it may be the service of LPG gases, all these were handed over to the private sector. So, the essential services which were under the control of the government were given away for the private participation. So, the role of the public sector was limited to 4 industries. So, the government kept under its control only 4 industries of strategic importance, and rest of the industries were handed over to the private sector. Now, the next feature of the industrial policy was disinvestment. Now, what is this disinvestment? Disinvestment is nothing but you try to pull out the capital. The government was trying to just pull out the capital invested in the public sector and allow the private sector to invest in these public sector units. Now, disinvestment was carried out in case of many public sector industrial enterprises. So, what were the public sector industrial enterprises? So, the government started disinvestment. So, disinvestment, in other words, the government, whatever the investment the government had made in those industries, the government took back the investments and allowed the private players to invest in these public sector industrial enterprises. Then, next one is policy towards foreign capital. So, before 1991, India had just locked all its doors and it was not allowing any foreign capital to enter India. Now, after this policy of 1991, it welcomed the foreign capital from abroad. So, whoever wanted to invest in India, they could invest. So, the share of equity participation was increased in many activities. Per FDI was permitted. So, there were so many industries which were started with 100% FDI. What is the meaning of FDI? FDI means foreign direct investment. So, this foreign direct investment, so it was Foreign direct investment was welcomed by the Indian government because India was in shortage of funds. She could not funds to start her own industry. So this foreign direct investment was a welcome move for all the industrialists in India. Then the next feature of the policy was automatic permission was now granted for technology agreements with foreign companies. Now, if before this 1991 industrial reform, any industry, any business person who wanted to have any technological agreement, he had to take permission from the Indian government. Now, because of the introduction of these reforms, this automatic permission was now granted. So, whoever wanted to make use of technology from abroad, he could enter into an agreement with anybody abroad for technological permission. So this was a major change in the industrial policy. Then next one was Foreign Investment Promotion Board. Foreign Investment Promotion Board was set up to promote and channelize foreign investment in India. So, as I told you earlier, foreign investments was more welcome after this industrial policy, and it was set up to promote and channelize. So, for whatever foreign investment came to India, it was this board used to channelize the foreign investment into the various industrial sectors. So, these were the important features of the industrial policy of 1991 introduced by the Indian government for the betterment of the industrial development in India. Now, let us look into what was the impact of the industrial policy. Now, the industrial policy has sought to liberate the industry from the shackles of licensing. That is, before, as I had told you earlier, this licensing Raj came to an end because of this liberalization. So, whatever the control of the Indian government over the business fraternity removed all the controls by delicensing. So, there was no need to license to get a license from the government to start any industry. So, this became an important feature, or this was an encouragement for the Indian industry. Then, next one is, so because of the liberation from the licensing sector, we could start more industries, then drastically reduce the role of the public sector. That means after this reform, the role in the public sector units was reduced drastically and private players came into existence. So we can call it as privatization. So here private companies were welcome to start the business. So they were the most major players here. Then we also encourage foreign private participation in industrial development. So foreign private participation in industrial development, in other words, we can call it as globalization. Now, what is globalization? Globalization we will look into in the forthcoming slides. Now, the first impact of the industrial policy was liberalization. Now, what is the meaning of liberalization? It is nothing but freedom. Freedom from what? Freedom from controls, freedom from governmental interference. It is, in other words, you give freedom to the industrial sector, or you are giving freedom to the business fraternity to do business. Now, liberalization. So, what are the features of liberalization? We will just look into here. Now, the first feature. So, if you can see here in the picture, we have the global economy. So, the whole world is considered as a globe, and the business fraternity is the whole world will be investing money anywhere, wherever they want, and then we see the rise in the business, or we can see this rise in the share index, or you can call the rise in the performance of the business community. Now, we will just look into what are the features of liberalization. So, first thing is, it abolished the licensing requirement in most of the industries except a short list. Now, because of liberalization, we could start the industry without any license. So the government recommended that only 6 industries had to be started with the license, and rest all other industries could be started without any license from the government. Then the next feature is freedom in deciding the scale of business activity. That means before liberalization, even if you had to expand the business, you had to take the permission from the government for more investment, or if you wanted to expand your business on a larger scale, then we had to take permission. But now, after this liberalization concept, there was freedom for the business fraternity. There were no restrictions, and he could expand his business as much as possible. So, or if he even wanted to contract his business also, he had to take permission. But all these controls were removed after the introduction of liberalization. Then removal of restrictions on the movement of goods and services. Now the government also, in order to liberate the business fraternity, it removed all the restrictions on the movement of goods and services. So goods and services could be moved from any place to any place without any governmental control. Then the next feature of liberalization is freedom in fixing the prices of goods and services. Now, before this liberalization, the government used to tell what is the price to be fixed for each product. But after the liberalization, introduction of liberalization, the business fraternity had the freedom to fix the prices of goods and services which were offered. Next, reduction in tax rates and lifting of unnecessary controls over the economy. Now, the tax burden is one of the biggest burden in the industrial sector. So, if you can see the tax rate for the industrial sector, it varies anywhere between 30 to 50% of the earnings of that industry. So, this is a huge burden on the industrial sector. So, in order to encourage the industrial sector to liberate it from the tax burden, the government introduced the reduction in tax rates and also lifting unnecessary controls over the economy. Next one, the sixth point, simplifying procedures for imports and exports. So, what are the simplifying procedures for imports and exports? As you know earlier, before the liberalization, introduction of liberalization, there were a lot of curbs on exports and imports of goods and services. The government used to restrict the exports of goods and also import of goods from foreign countries. Now, after the introduction of liberalization, they have simplified the procedures for imports and exports. And lastly, making it easier to attract foreign capital and technology to India. So, it created an environment in India. So, the last feature of liberalization is it made it easier, or there was an environment to attract the foreign capital to enter India. So, foreigners could invest in the Indian industry. So, these are the various features of liberalization reform which was introduced in 1991. Next important concept which was introduced after 1991 is the privatization. Now, what do you mean by privatization? Privatization aims at giving greater role to the private sector. So, you give greater role to the private sector means you are inviting the private people to invest in the business. So, in the nation building process. So, in the development of the nation, they had invited the private parties to invest in the nation building process and a reduced role of the public sector. So, the government took a back seat. So, it encouraged the flow of private investment in the public sector units. Then, this was the reversal of the development strategy pursued so far by Indian planners. So, until this concept of privatization, Indian planners used to think that the Indian industry had to be protected. So, they undertook almost all the industrial sector was under the control of the Indian government, and they tried to protect the Indian industry from the foreign companies. So this was a move which was against the rule. This was a reversal of the development strategy pursued so far by Indian planners. Now, what is this reversal of the development strategy? In the beginning, the development strategy was to protect the Indian industry from the foreign industries, or Indian government wanted to have a control over all the industrial units in the nation. Then after this introduction of the 1991 industrial policy, the government took a U-turn. So it encouraged the private players to come into the public sector domain. Disinvestment means transfer in the public sector enterprises to the private sector. What do we mean by disinvestment? Disinvestment means you are taking out the capital of the government which you had introduced in the public sector, and you are replacing it by the funds given by the private parties. So it means transfer of the public sector enterprises to the private sector. Then it results in dilution of stake of the government in the public enterprise. As you all know, in the public sector units, almost 51% of the capital holding, it is held by the government of India. Now, with the introduction of privatization, this 51% of the capital holding was removed from the public sector units and it was replaced by funds given by the private parties. Then next we look into the third important factor, that is the globalization. If you can see in this picture here, so there is a global economy where there is a lot of connectivity and all the persons are working towards the emergence of a new global economy. Now, let us look into the meaning of the word globalization. Globalization means integration of the various economies of the world. So, you see that there is an integration or there is an understanding between all the economies of the world which lead towards the emergence of a cohesive global economy. So, where there is a global economy which is closely knit and which is closely interrelated. So, in this globalization, we should understand that there is a close understanding between all the countries, all the economies of the world, and we consider the whole world as one business unit. Now, what are the regulations of this before globalization? Coming to the next feature of globalization, we can see that regulations which were there with respect to licensing of imports, tariff restrictions and quantitative restrictions. So, before we had this concept of globalization, there were a lot of licensing of imports. So, any businessman who was engaged in import trade, he could not directly engage himself in import trade. He had to take the license from the government. So, these were some of the rules and regulations which are imposed by the Indian government from other countries. Then, tariff restrictions. So, tariff restrictions means you introduce some sort of a fee for any imports which we are getting from other countries or for the exports which we are exporting to other countries, and also quantitative restrictions. Now, what do you mean by quantitative restrictions? So, they used to impose a limit on the amount of restrictions. So, what is the quantity you are importing or what is the quantity you are exporting? So, all these had to be under the control of the government. Next, in globalization, we can learn that it involves an increased level of interaction and interdependence among the various nations of the global economy. So, through the help of globalization, we can see there is a lot of interaction and interdependence. So, there is a lot of interdependence means wherever there is a shortage of imports or raw materials or anything, some other nation should be able to easily provide it to the place where it is in deficiency, and there is an interdependence among the various nations of the global economy. So, the global economy is interrelated and interconnected. Then, it also observes that physical geographical gap or political boundaries no longer remain barriers. So, business should cross the political boundaries of any country. So there should not be any barriers relating to business. So barriers may be in the form of licenses, tariffs, or quantitative restrictions. So all these barriers should be removed, and we should consider the whole world as a business unit, and where everybody will thrive to make a better place for all of us. So to serve a customer in a distant geographical market. So if it is you can serve any customer across the globe. So this is the main concept behind the globalization. Then next is demonetization. If you can just remember, it was on November 8th, 2016. So the government of India made an announcement on November 8th, 2016 with profound implications for the Indian economy. So what was this announcement? So in this announcement, the Indian government, the two largest denominations, that is 500 rupees and 1000 rupees, were demonetized. Now what is the meaning of demonetized? So demonetized means which should not remain in existence, that is ceasing to be a legal tender. So these 500 rupees and 1000 rupees notes were to be removed from circulation, and they had to be surrendered to the bank in exchange for 100 rupees or notes of any other denomination. So, and these 500 and 1000 rupees notes could be used for specified purposes such as paying utility bills. And those who had this 500 and 1000 rupees notes, they could use it for very specific purposes which were specified by the government. For example, the medical bills. Then we could also see, if you can just observe the other impacts of demonetization. So in this demonetization, we could see that there were restrictions placed on convertibility of domestic money and bank deposits. So people could not deposit money in the banks. So what was the condition? So if you had any unaccounted money then or undeclared income, so that money had to be declared, tax had to be paid, only then you could deposit such money. Otherwise, you could not deposit that money. Then next, the aim of demonetization was to curb corruption. So corruption means it may be in the form of bribes, or it may be in the form of, we all know what is corruption is. So you try to bribe somebody to get the things done, or you bribe somebody to get the file moved. So all these things amounts to corruption. So usually we all know that whenever there is a case of a bribe, it will always be in notes of higher denominations. So once you just declare the notes of higher denomination as not fit for circulation, then automatically all sorts of corruption will come down. Then counterfeiting the notes of high denomination notes for illegal activities. So usually whenever any business is done illegally, most of the people, they use this high denomination notes. So counterfeiting means you make the duplicates of these notes and use it for illegal activities. And all these, we had to put an end for all these kinds of illegal activities, and especially the accumulation of black money. So black money, as you all know, it is nothing but unaccounted money, or that money for which the person who has not declared it as his own income. So this black money generated by income that has not been declared to the tax authorities. So to put an end to all these illegal activities, the Indian government introduced this demonetization. Now let us look into what are the features of demonetization. See, after demonetization, the Indian government introduced this 2000 rupees notes which were issued. Then let us look into the features of demonetization. Demonetization is viewed as a tax administration measure. Now what do you mean by tax administration measure? So it is one way of collecting tax from the people. Now how do you collect tax from people through demonetization? See, it was through cash holdings arising from declared income. So whatever is the declared income, that money we will be collecting as savings for the bank accounts, but that money for which there has been no declaration by any of the individuals, for that he had to pay the penalty. So the declared income was readily deposited in banks and exchanged for new notes. So we could exchange the notes which were for the money which has been declared as income by any individual. Then next, we could also see that demonetization is interpreted as a shift on the part of the government. So it is a shift on the part of the government, indicating that tax evasion will no longer be tolerated or accepted. So through demonetization, the government wanted to ensure that there will be tax evasion or black money hoarding. All this will not be tolerated and it will be taken very, very seriously. Then next feature of demonetization is it also led to tax administration channelizing savings into the formal financial system. That means, so through demonetization, whoever persons, or it may be usually the ladies, they just keep these notes of these denominations in their cupboard. They don't put it in the bank also. So because of this demonetization, all the money which was hoarded in cupboards or which was hoarded in various other places, it came out of that place and it went through to the bank. Because of the act of this demonetization, we could see that the savings which were hidden by ladies of the household, it came into the main system. So whatever savings they had, so it could reach the bank. That is, it reached into the formal financial system. Then next is another feature of demonetization is to create a less cash or cash light economy. So this demonetization, the main aim of demonetization was to have a cashless society. Now what is a cashless society? We use our mobile phones to make the payments, or through the digital form of payment we can make payments, whether it is for our household goods or whether it is to buy consumer durables. For all our purchases, we should make use of this digital currency. Then next one, that is we create a less cash or cash light economy. That is channeling more savings through the formal financial system and improving the tax compliance. So the main aim of this demonetization was you encourage people to save more in the bank, make all their payments through the phones, or all the payments could be made online with the help of the internet. Then next, if you can just study the impact of demonetization. So what was the impact of demonetization of India? So what happened, whether it is the money or the interest rate, there was a steady decline in cash transactions. So because of demonetization, there was a steady decline in cash transactions. Secondly, the bank deposits increased. So whatever money was hidden in all the households, it came back and it thereby increased the bank deposits. Then there was also an increase in financial savings. So people began to save more in the bank so that it will be easy for them to make payments whenever they are shopping. Then next, private wealth. It declined since some high demonetized notes were not returned and real estate prices fell. Yes. So private wealth means, so those people who are engaged in black money, who are holding black money, most of their notes, it became invalid, and because of that, what happened was there was a real estate prices fell. So most of the high demonetized notes were not returned at all. Why? Because they could not declare that income, and then even if they had to declare the income, they had to pay the tax penalty, which they were not ready to pay, and because of which the real estate prices came down. Then next, public sector wealth, there was no effect at all. Then digitization. Now what is this digitization? It is nothing but digital transactions. Nowadays it is more easier for us. We are using more and more the Google Pay, Phone Pay and Paytm. So there are various modes of paying through the digital method. So this has increased in the last few years. Then we have the real estate. So the real estate prices also declined. Then tax collection. So there was a rise in income tax collection because people were waiting for a chance to get their notes validated, or all those invalid currencies which they had hoarded over the so many years, that came to the bank, and because of that they had to declare the income, and thereby they paid the penalty and declared the income, as a result of which there was a rise in income tax collection because of increased disclosure. People disclose the undisclosed income, and thereby the income tax collection rose. Then next, we will look into the impact of government policy changes on business and industry. So what was the impact of the government policy changes on business and industry? Because of the new industrial policy introduced in 1991, because of that, and also the concepts of liberalization, privatization and globalization, we could see certain changes in the Indian economy. So what are those changes? So first thing is increase in competition. So there was a lot of increase in competition. So as a result of the changes in rules of the industrial licensing and entry of foreign firms, competition for Indian firms has increased, especially in the service industries like telecommunication, airlines, banking, insurance, which were earlier in the public sector. So because of the entry of foreign firms, we could see that there was a rise in the competition. So in which sectors the rise was? In telecommunication sector. We could see there was so many mobile company services which entered India, and they were providing the services, and we could also see the rise in the number of airlines which were ferrying the passengers to international destinations, and also the banking sector where international banks came to India, and also the insurance sector, which was the sole the Indian government was the sole owner of the insurance sector. Now this insurance sector also was open to the private players. So all these sectors had to face stiff competition from the foreign companies. Then next, more demanding customers. So once we had this privatization, liberalization and globalization, we could see that there were more demanding customers. The customers wanted more and more because they were well informed. They were well aware of all the products. They know exactly what they want. So we could see that the customers were more and more demanding. Then next one is rapidly changing technological environment. So we can see that increased competition forces the firm to develop new ways to survive and grow in the market. So as you all know, whenever there is a competitor, we are more alert of how we behave or how we should remain in the race. So in order to survive, all the companies had to strive hard to remain in competition. Then fourth one is necessity for change. So in a regulated environment of pre-1991 era, the firms could have relatively stable policies and practices. So before 1991, they had a protected government which was protecting all their activities. But after 1991, since they had to face stiff competition from the global players, all the business firms which were engaged in business in India had to change, and they found that it was necessary for themselves to change their business practices, and also they had to change the business activities also. Then next one is need for developing human resources. So before 1991, Indian enterprises have suffered for long with inadequately trained personnel. So after 1991, the whole business environment had changed, and because of that, there was also a need for the change in human resources. There was a requirement for skilled human resources who knew what is the need of the hour. Then next impact is market orientation. So what is this market orientation? Before this 1991, before the industrial policy of 1991, it was the era of product orientation. What is this product orientation? The companies used to produce a product first and see that it is being sold to the consumers. But after 1991, they shifted to market orientation. So what is this market orientation? In this market orientation, the firms have to study and analyze the market first and then produce the goods accordingly. So as per the market orientation, first you feel what is the need of the consumer, what is the consumer's taste and preferences, and then you produce the product and see that the consumer is satisfied with your product. Then the last point is the loss of budgetary support to the public sector. So in this, we could witness that the government was not supporting the public sector. They were not providing the budgetary allocation for the public sector. So because of that, the public sector had to fight for its survival. It had to perform so that it could remain in the market. Next, we could also see that the impact of the government policies. The Indian enterprises have developed strategies and adopted business processes and procedures to meet the challenge of competition. So, one of the huge impact of the government policy is the Indian enterprises, they had to develop strategies and adopt business processes and procedures to see that they remain in business. So they became more alert because of this increased competition from the foreign players. So they became more customer focused and adopted measures to improve customer relationship and satisfaction. So they became aware that if the customer is satisfied, then there will not be any need for any other kind of promotional activity. So they know that now they became aware that to be customer focused and to improve the customer relationship, it is very, very important. So this was one of the main impact of the industrial government policy on industry and business. So it is very, very important for all the businesses to maintain a good customer relationship. So with this, we come to the end of this session. Thank you.